Isabel, given the circumstances of your situation, we've decided your portion of the estate should be reconsidered. My brother Carlos sat across from me at our family's mahogany dining table, the same table where I'd once recited multiplication tables with ketchup on my nose. Now, at 32, I was being put on trial. My father, Colonel Miguel Rodriguez, sat at the head with his arms crossed, wearing the same expression he'd had when I forgot to salute at a memorial service 20 years ago. What Carlos means, my other brother Diego added, adjusting his army dress uniform, is that given your distance from the family legacy, it's only fair that your inheritance be redistributed. I blinked. My portion, the house, the land, the trust fund I'd never asked for. You've embarrassed this family enough, Isabel. My father said, his voice carrying the same authority that had commanded soldiers for 3 decades. The Rodriguez name means something. Honor, duty, discipline, not whatever it is you've become. I laughed not because it was funny, but because the alternative was screaming. Here I was, 32 years old, being disowned by the very people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. But let me tell you how I got here, because this story doesn't start with my disgrace. It starts with me refusing to be anything less than who I was meant to be. My name is Isabel Rodriguez, and I come from what outsiders would call an American military dynasty. My father, Colonel Miguel Rodriguez, served 30 years in the Army. My brother Carlos, 35, made lieutenant colonel by 34, the golden boy with a perfect service record and political connections that opened every door. Diego, 34, tracked to make lieutenant colonel within the year, was known throughout Fort Benning for his tactical innovations. Then there was me, Captain Isabel Rodriguez at 32, exactly where I should be after 9 years of service, but somehow always the disappointment. From the outside, we were the perfect military family. 4th of July barbecues with flags flying, Christmas cards featuring 4 people in dress blues, neighbors whispering about how proud my parents must be. But inside our house, love came with conditions, and I was the only one who seemed to struggle meeting them. I was 8 years old when I realized I was different from my brothers. Carlos and Diego would cry when our father scolded them, but I would stand there, look him straight in the eye, and say, "I understand, sir." Not because I was heartless, but because I was learning that strength wasn't about tears, it was about comprehension. When my bicycle chain broke at 12, instead of asking my brothers for help like any normal sister would, I spent 3 hours in the garage taking it apart piece by piece. When I finally got it running, my father walked by and said, "Good, self-reliance is important." It was the closest thing to praise I'd received in months. I wasn't the daughter who needed rescuing. When our neighbor's cat got stuck in a tree, I climbed up to get it. When Diego had nightmares about his first deployment to Iraq, I sat with him through the night. When Carlos struggled with advanced staff planning, I helped him study, even though he'd never admit it. But no matter what I did, I lived in their shadows. At dinner, conversations weren't conversations, they were reports. Carlos made lieutenant colonel. Diego's been selected for the advanced course. Isabel, any word on your promotion board? The truth is, I worked twice as hard to prove I wasn't the weak link. I graduated from West Point in 2013, not top of my class, but solid. I passed selection for military intelligence. I deployed to Afghanistan twice, Iraq once. I learned Arabic, Pashto, and Farsi. I tracked insurgent networks, analyzed intelligence that saved lives they'll never know about. After 9 years of exemplary service, I was a captain tracking toward major, exactly where I should be. But somehow, it was never enough. I was the only one who ever asked why, and in a house like ours, why was treated like treason. But I wasn't asking to rebel. I was asking because I wanted to understand. While my brothers saw orders to follow, I saw problems to solve. While they saw hierarchy to respect, I saw people to protect. I remember writing in my journal during my first deployment, "One day they'll understand that the daughter they think is difficult is actually the one who sees what they can't. One day they'll realize that asking why isn't defiance, it's intelligence." I believed it then, and sitting at that dining table facing their judgment, I still believed it. "You think I care about your damn legacy?" I said, rising from my chair. "Take it. Take the house, take the medals, take the name. I paused, looking each of them in the eye. Actually, keep the name. I'm done with it. I walked out that night without packing a bag, without saying goodbye. No home, no job, no uniform, just me, their disgrace. And for the first time in my life, I was free. But what they didn't know was that I had been living a completely different life than they imagined. That decision in Afghanistan would change everything, but not in the way they thought. Let me take you back to Afghanistan, to the moment that would define everything that came after. It was October 2019, northern Helmand province. I was a captain, then assigned to a provincial reconstruction team, coordinating intelligence for humanitarian operations. Nothing glamorous, analyzing satellite feeds, debriefing local sources, making sure aid convoys didn't drive into Taliban ambushes. The kind of work that saves lives quietly without headlines or heroics. The morning started like any other. Coffee too bitter to drink, a classified folder thick with overnight intelligence reports, and the usual Zoro 500 briefing. We were supporting a medical aid convoy, 27 aid workers from Doctors Without Borders, carrying supplies to remote villages that hadn't seen medical care in months. The convoy had been rerouted due to washed-out roads from recent flooding. Standard protocol: when routes change units, pull back and wait for confirmation from higher command. Don't engage unless fired upon. Trust the system. Trust command. But 3 days into the operation, something felt wrong. A 15-year-old boy slipped through our checkpoint at dawn, shaking with terror. He wasn't a plant. I'd been doing this long enough to know the difference. His village, he said, was being used as bait. The Taliban had moved in during the night, positioning themselves along the convoy's new route. I pulled every intelligence feed we had. Satellite imagery, drone footage, signals, intercepts. The pattern was there if you knew how to look. Too many military-age males in a village that should have been mostly empty, communications chatter that didn't match normal patterns. The convoy wasn't walking into a natural disaster. They were walking into a carefully planned ambush. I radioed command immediately. Requesting immediate clearance to intercept and warn convoy directly. High probability of enemy contact along planned route. The response came back within minutes. Negative. Maintain current position. Do not engage unless fired upon. Wait for confirmation through proper channels. I stared at the radio, my hands shaking with frustration. Proper channels would take hours. The convoy would reach the kill zone in 90 minutes. 27 people. Doctors, nurses, aid workers who had left comfortable lives to help strangers in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. People who trusted that soldiers like me would keep them safe. I thought about my father's favorite saying, "Orders are orders, Isabel. The moment you start second-guessing command, you become a liability." I thought about Carlos and Diego, who had never faced a moment like this, who had never had to choose between following orders and following their conscience. Then I thought about those 27 people driving toward an ambush while I sat in a safe compound following protocol. So I made the call that would change my life forever. Rodriguez to team leader. I'm taking a small element to intercept the convoy. Rodriguez, you do not have authorization for that action. Copy that, I said, and switched off my radio. I took 4 volunteer soldiers who trusted my judgment more than they feared the consequences. We moved fast, using back roads and terrain features to avoid detection. When we reached the convoy, I had exactly 3 minutes to convince the lead driver that his GPS was wrong and his planned route would kill everyone in those vehicles. The aid workers looked at me like I was crazy, a young captain telling them to ignore their carefully planned route to trust a soldier they'd never met. But something in my voice, something in my eyes convinced them. We diverted that convoy 15 minutes before they would have entered the kill zone. 3 days later, when a routine patrol finally swept the area, they found improvised explosive devices, sniper positions, and evidence of a complex ambush that would have devastated that medical convoy. 27 people went home to their families because I broke the rules, and for that I was pulled from the field. No medals, no commendations, just a cold room, an officer I'd never met, and a statement that would follow me for the rest of my career. Captain Rodriguez violated established protocol and exceeded her authority. She is hereby relieved of duty pending investigation. I wasn't court-martialed. I wasn't imprisoned. I was suspended, stripped of my security clearance, and sent home in civilian clothes with instructions to wait. Wait for what? An apology, a second chance, a recognition that saving 27 lives might have been worth bending a few rules. None came. When I walked into our house in San Antonio, my father was waiting in the driveway. He didn't speak, just stood with his arms crossed. We sat in the living room, the silence louder than any argument we'd ever had. He didn't yell. He didn't ask what happened. He just said, "You've brought shame to this family." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What happened out there?" Just shame, like I was a stain on his uniform. Carlos arrived the next day, his disapproval radiating through the house. "You went against command," he said flatly. "It's black and white." "No," I snapped back. "It's gray. People lived because I acted." "That's not your call to make." "I was there. You weren't. You were reckless." Diego came later, fresh from his own successful deployment chest, full of ribbons and ambition. I thought maybe he'd understand. Maybe he'd remember the sister who had helped him through his nightmares, who had taught him that courage sometimes means standing alone. But he just looked at me and said, "You made things hard for all of us, Isabel." Little did they know someone very important had been watching my career, and that decision in Afghanistan had caught the attention of people who understood that sometimes the right choice looks wrong until history proves it right. As I walked away from that house for what I thought was the last time, I had no idea that a mysterious letter was already on its way. For 3 years, I disappeared. Not literally, I was living in a cramped apartment above a mechanic shop in San Antonio, working night security at a warehouse, drinking burnt coffee, and wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. The Army had quietly processed my discharge, and I found myself a 30-year-old veteran with a gap in her resume that she couldn't explain to civilian employers. "Why did you leave the military?" they'd ask during job interviews. "How do you explain that you were suspended for saving lives? How do you tell someone that doing the right thing cost you everything you'd worked for?" I lived on savings and pride, refusing to contact my family, refusing to beg for help. Some nights I'd lie awake wondering if my father was right. Maybe I was just stubborn. Maybe I should have followed orders and let someone else make the hard decisions. But then I'd remember the faces of those aid workers when I told them to change course, the relief in their eyes when they realized they were safe. 27 people who got to go home because I trusted my instincts over my orders. That's what kept me going during those dark months. Not vindication, not revenge, just the quiet knowledge that I had done the right thing, even if it cost me everything. I was working the midnight shift at the warehouse when everything changed. It was a Tuesday in March 2020, 3 years after Afghanistan. I came home to find a plain white envelope slipped under my apartment door. No return address, no markings, just my name written in block letters, Isabel Rodriguez. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an official letterhead I'd never seen before, Joint Special Operations Command. The message was brief. Report to Building 1482, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Security clearance Alpha 7 required, immediate. At the bottom, a phone number and the instruction, memorize and destroy. I stared at that letter for an hour. Alpha 7 clearance was above anything I'd ever held, the kind of clearance reserved for operations that didn't officially exist. Someone had been watching. Someone had read my file, really read it, and decided they didn't care about my suspension. They cared about results. I made the call. "This is Rodriguez. I received your invitation. Report tomorrow at 0800. Bring nothing but yourself and your courage." The line went dead. Fort Bragg was different from any base I'd ever seen. The building I was directed to looked like administrative offices from the outside, but inside was a maze of secure conference rooms and workstations filled with people who moved with the quiet confidence of professionals operating beyond normal military channels. I was met by a woman in her 50s, no rank insignia, no name tag. Just an intense stare and a handshake that could crack walnuts. "Captain Rodriguez, Or should I say former Captain Rodriguez? Ma'am. I'm Sarah. That's all you need to know for now. I've read about Afghanistan. Interesting decision you made. I saved 27 lives. Yes, you did. Would you make the same choice again? I didn't hesitate. Yes. She smiled for the first time. Good. Because we're about to offer you opportunities to make choices like that every day. The difference is, this time, you'll have the authority to back them up. What happened next was unlike anything in my military experience. No formal training pipeline, no lengthy orientation, just a series of increasingly complex scenarios designed to test not my ability to follow orders, but my ability to make the right decision when orders didn't exist. Most officers, Sarah explained, are trained to operate within established parameters. We need people who can operate without parameters, who can see patterns others miss, and act on incomplete information. My first mission was a test infiltrate a suspected arms trafficking network in Eastern Europe, gather intelligence, and report back. No backup, no communication except in emergencies, no rules of engagement except don't start an international incident. I spent 6 weeks in Sofia, Bulgaria, posing as a freelance journalist, investigating human trafficking. What I found was bigger than arms dealing. It was a pipeline moving everything from weapons to people to drugs across 3 continents. Instead of just gathering intelligence, I identified the key players and provided information that led to coordinated raids across 7 countries. The network was dismantled, hundreds of victims were freed, and enough weapons to supply a small army were seized. When I returned to Fort Bragg, Sarah was waiting with a new uniform. Army, but with no unit patches, no identifying marks. Congratulations, Major Rodriguez. Your promotion is retroactive to the date of your first mission. Major, they'd not only reinstated me, they'd promoted me. How is that possible? Your suspension was officially reviewed and overturned. Your actions in Afghanistan have been reclassified as exceeding authority in service of mission success. Congratulations, you're a hero. That was 4 years ago. Since then, I've operated in places that don't appear on maps, using names that aren't mine, doing things I still can't talk about. I've prevented nuclear materials from reaching terrorists, extracted hostages from situations that would have meant war if handled incorrectly, and tracked down threats that most people never hear about because we stopped them first. Each successful mission brought new challenges, new responsibilities, new trust. Last year, after preventing what would have been the largest terrorist attack on American soil since 9/11, I was promoted again. Lieutenant Colonel Isabel Rodriguez, the same rank as my golden boy brother Carlos, achieved through merit in the shadows, while he played politics in the light. My family had no idea. To them, I was still their disgrace, their cautionary tale about what happens when you go against the system. But these weren't ordinary missions. They were the kind that could change history, and I was about to discover that my biggest challenge wasn't international terrorists or nuclear smugglers. It was going home. Over the next 3 years, I became someone my family couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. The work was unlike anything I'd experienced in conventional military service. While most soldiers train for scenarios they hope never to face, I was living scenarios that would make Hollywood screenwriters nervous. Each mission built on the last, each success opening doors to operations that required not just skill, but the kind of judgment that comes from understanding that sometimes there are no good choices, only necessary ones. My second mission took me to Somalia. Intelligence indicated that 3 American aid workers had been kidnapped by al-Shabaab militants and were being held in a compound outside Mogadishu. Conventional rescue would have required a full military operation with all the diplomatic complications that would follow. Instead, I spent 2 months infiltrating the network as a potential arms buyer, building relationships, earning trust. When I finally located the hostages, I didn't call in an airstrike. I arranged for a local dispute that required moving prisoners, then orchestrated a transportation accident that left the kidnappers stranded while I extracted the Americans through a route I'd spent weeks preparing. 3 people came home. The operation never made the news because officially, it never happened. Somalia led to Syria, where I spent 4 months tracking a network smuggling chemical weapons components. The intelligence was fragmentary. Intercepted communications, suspicious financial transfers, satellite imagery that suggested something significant but couldn't confirm what. I embedded with a refugee assistance organization, using my language skills and cultural training to move through areas where traditional intelligence gathering was impossible. What I found was worse than we'd suspected, not just components, but a functioning laboratory producing weaponized chemical agents for distribution to terrorist cells across Europe. Instead of reporting back and waiting for a conventional response, I identified the key chemist and convinced him that his location had been compromised by rival factions. He fled, taking critical documentation with him, documentation that led to the arrest of 17 terrorists across 4 countries and prevented attacks that could have killed thousands. The Syria operation earned me promotion to lieutenant colonel, but more importantly, it earned me the trust of people who understood that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that never become public. My commanding officer, I still only knew her as Sarah, called me into her office after Syria. "You've noticed that we don't operate like conventional military units," she said. "I've noticed that we get results. Results that matter. Each operation you've completed has prevented scenarios that would have destabilized entire regions. You've saved more lives in 3 years than most soldiers save in entire careers." She pulled out a classified folder, thick with documentation I'd never seen. "Your Afghanistan decision isn't an anomaly, Rodriguez. It's exactly the kind of thinking we need. You see patterns others miss, you act when others hesitate, and you understand that sometimes the right choice requires breaking the wrong rules." That's when I learned about the organization I'd been working for. Joint Special Activities Command wasn't officially part of any service branch. We reported directly to the Secretary of Defense, operating under authorities that most military personnel didn't know existed. We handle situations that are too sensitive for conventional military operations, too complex for intelligence agencies, and too urgent for diplomatic solutions, Sarah explained. "We're the people who solve problems that officially don't exist." My 3rd year brought the mission that would define my career, tracking a network attempting to smuggle nuclear materials from former Soviet states to buyers in the Middle East. The investigation started with a single intercepted communication and led me through 6 countries over 8 months. I posed as various covers: a mining engineer, an environmental consultant, a documentary filmmaker, building a comprehensive picture of how weapons-grade uranium was being moved from decommissioned facilities in Kazakhstan to ports in Turkey. The network was sophisticated, with legitimate business fronts and government contacts that made conventional law enforcement approaches impossible. Each piece of the puzzle required different skills: technical knowledge to understand nuclear materials, cultural sensitivity to operate in diverse environments, and strategic thinking to see how individual transactions connected to larger patterns. When I finally identified the key players and the timeline for the transfer, I had less than 72 hours to prevent enough nuclear material to build multiple dirty bombs from reaching people who would use it without hesitation. Working with contacts I'd developed across multiple agencies and governments, I orchestrated a series of seemingly unrelated events: customs inspections, transportation delays, financial audits, and a carefully timed leak to investigative journalists that exposed the network's activities. The uranium never left Kazakhstan. The network was dismantled across multiple countries. The buyers were arrested in operations that appeared completely unconnected to each other. 3 months later, I was promoted to lieutenant colonel, the same rank that had taken my brother Carlos 12 years to achieve through conventional career progression. But the promotion came with something more valuable than rank: the knowledge that I had found my place in the world. I wasn't the daughter who couldn't fit into the military mold my family had created. I was an officer who operated beyond conventional molds, who succeeded precisely because I thought differently. Meanwhile, my family had no idea their disgrace was about to receive recognition at the highest levels of government. They still thought I was working night security, too ashamed to contact them, living proof that challenging authority leads to failure. They had no idea that I was planning to challenge their assumptions in the most public way possible. The invitation that would change everything was already in the mail, and what happened next would shock everyone in that room, starting with the moment when my brother Diego's promotion ceremony became my moment of vindication. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in October 2023, delivered to an address my family shouldn't have known I was using. White cardstock gold, embossing the kind of formal military invitation that had been a staple of my childhood. You are cordially invited to the promotion ceremony of Major Diego Rodriguez to Lieutenant Colonel, United States Army. Family attendance requested. I stared at it for a long time, not because I missed them, I'd made peace with our separation years ago, but because of what it represented. Diego was finally achieving the rank I'd held for over a year, the rank they thought was forever beyond my reach. My first instinct was to throw it away. What was the point? I'd built a life they couldn't understand, achieved success they couldn't measure, found purpose they'd never recognize. I didn't need their validation anymore. But as I sat in my secure apartment near Fort Bragg, surrounded by commendations they'd never see, and photos from missions they'd never hear about, I realized this wasn't about need. It was about choice. For 29 years I had lived in the shadow of their expectations. For 3 years, I had lived in exile from their judgment. Now, for the first time, I had the opportunity to step into the light not as the daughter seeking approval, but as the officer I had become. Sarah found me in my office that afternoon, staring at the invitation. "Family gathering?" she asked, noting the formal cardstock. "My brother's promotion ceremony, Lieutenant Colonel." She raised an eyebrow. "Same rank you achieved 2 years ahead of him through merit rather than politics. Are you going?" "I'm thinking about it." "What's holding you back?" I considered the question. Nothing, actually. For the first time in my life, absolutely nothing. That evening, I made my decision. Not out of spite, not for revenge, but because I had finally become someone worth seeing. The girl who had asked why had become the woman who found how, and it was time for them to meet her. The ceremony was scheduled for Fort Hood, Texas, neutral territory close enough to San Antonio for family to attend, prestigious enough for Diego's achievement to carry weight. I had exactly 2 weeks to prepare not for confrontation, but for revelation. I chose my uniform carefully. Army dress blues, every ribbon and badge earned through operations they'd never know about. The Lieutenant Colonel insignia, polished to mirror brightness, positioned exactly where it should be above the rank my golden brother Carlos had achieved, equal to what Diego was about to receive. But more than the uniform, I prepared mentally. This wasn't about proving them wrong, it was about showing them who I had always been capable of becoming. The drive to Fort Hood took 3 hours, 3 hours of Texas highway and memories. I passed the exit for our family home in San Antonio and felt nothing but curiosity about what the evening would bring. I arrived at the base exactly 15 minutes before the ceremony began, late enough to avoid awkward small talk, early enough to find a good seat. The auditorium was filled with military families, the usual mixture of pride and nervous energy that accompanied promotion ceremonies. I slipped into the back row unnoticed in a crowd of dress uniforms. From my position, I could see my family in the front row, my father in his dress blues despite retirement, my mother in a navy suit she reserved for important occasions, Carlos in his lieutenant colonel uniform, with wife and children beside him. They looked exactly as I remembered, proud, proper, completely convinced of their own righteousness. My father sat with the bearing of a man who had never doubted his decisions. Carlos wore the satisfied expression of someone whose career had proceeded exactly as planned. On stage, Diego stood at attention, while the base commander, Brigadier General Patricia Hawkins, prepared to begin the ceremony. Diego looked confident, ready for the recognition he'd earned through solid performance and careful career management. I felt a moment of genuine happiness for him. Despite everything, Diego was my brother, and he deserved this promotion. The fact that it would pale in comparison to what was about to happen wasn't his fault. General Hawkins stepped to the podium, and the ceremony began with the usual formalities: reading of orders, acknowledgement of family and friends, recognition of Diego's achievements. Standard promotion ceremony script, the kind I'd attended dozens of times throughout my career. But then, General Hawkins paused mid-sentence, her eyes scanning the auditorium. When her gaze reached the back row, she stopped, blinked, then smiled the kind of smile that suggested she'd just discovered something unexpected and delightful. She leaned slightly toward the microphone, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "Well, I'll be damned." A murmur ran through the audience. This wasn't standard ceremony protocol. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hawkins continued, "I apologize for the interruption, but when someone like Lieutenant Colonel Isabel Rodriguez walks into the room, that's not something you ignore." Every head in the auditorium turned. The room fell silent, except for the soft echo of my boots on the auditorium floor as I stood and walked forward. Hundreds of pairs of eyes tracked my movement, but I only cared about 4 pairs, my family's. My father's shoulders stiffened. My mother's hand went to her mouth. Carlos leaned forward like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. And Diego looked like the boy he'd been 20 years ago, confused and suddenly unsure of his script. General Hawkins stepped down from the podium and met me halfway down the aisle. "Didn't expect to see you here, Rodriguez," she said, extending her hand. "But I'm damn glad I did." I took her hand firmly. "Couldn't miss a family promotion, ma'am." She chuckled, the sound carrying through the silent auditorium. "I thought I was the only one here who knew the kind of work you've been doing." What happened next shocked everyone in that room, including me, because General Hawkins did something that transformed my brother's ceremony into something none of us would ever forget. General Hawkins turned to face the audience, her hand still gripping mine, and what she said next changed everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to pause this ceremony for a moment of recognition that, frankly, is long overdue." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "When I planned today's events, I had no idea we'd have the honor of Lieutenant Colonel Isabel Rodriguez joining us." The murmur that ran through the crowd was different now, curious, anticipatory. These were military families who understood that unscripted moments at formal ceremonies usually meant something significant was happening. "Rodriguez has led some of the most delicate and dangerous operations I've ever read about." General Hawkins continued, her eyes scanning the audience before settling on my family. "Hell operations I wasn't even supposed to read about. When half the world was focused on headlines, she was 3 steps ahead behind them." I watched my father's face transform from confusion to something approaching shock. This wasn't the script he'd written in his mind about his disgraceful daughter showing up to embarrass the family. "You want to talk about leadership?" General Hawkins gestured toward me, her voice gaining strength. "Quiet valor service that expects nothing in return. That's your example right there." Carlos had gone very still, his wife whispering urgently in his ear, asking what was happening. Diego remained frozen on stage, his promotion ceremony suddenly secondary to whatever was unfolding in front of him. "3 years ago," General Hawkins said, "Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez made a decision in Afghanistan that saved 27 civilian lives. She violated direct orders to do it, was suspended for it, and never once complained about the consequences." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. What the Rodriguez family might not know is that her decision has since become a case study at the Command and General Staff College. We now teach her actions as an example of moral courage under fire of leadership that prioritizes human life over bureaucratic protocol. My mother had tears in her eyes. Not tears of shame or embarrassment, but something I'd never seen directed at me before, pride. "But that's not why she's one of the finest officers I've had the privilege to work with," General Hawkins continued. "Over the past 4 years, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez has conducted operations that I can't discuss in detail, but I can tell you this: she has personally prevented terrorist attacks that would have killed thousands, dismantled trafficking networks that were destabilizing entire regions, and stopped weapons of mass destruction from reaching people who would have used them without hesitation." A colonel in the 3rd row started to applaud, then others joined in. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, applauding not my brother's promotion, but my service my family was hearing about for the first time. "The Rodriguez family should know," General Hawkins said, as the applause died down, "that their daughter is exactly the kind of officer our nation needs, someone who thinks independently, acts decisively, and never forgets that our ultimate mission is protecting people, not following procedures." I looked at my family as General Hawkins spoke. My father sat rigid, his worldview reshaping itself in real time. The daughter he'd written off as a failure was being praised by a general whose opinion he'd never dare question. Carlos was staring at my uniform, specifically at the lieutenant colonel insignia on my collar, the same rank he'd achieved after 12 years of careful career management I'd earned through operations he couldn't imagine. When I learned that Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez would be attending her brother's ceremony today, General Hawkins said, "I couldn't pass up the opportunity to publicly acknowledge what she's done for this country. Too often, the heroes who work in shadows never receive recognition. Today, that changes." She turned to address me directly. "Rodriguez, your family hell, your country owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid. Thank you for your service, your sacrifice, and your unwavering commitment to doing what's right regardless of the cost." The applause this time lasted nearly 2 minutes. I saw people in the audience wiping their eyes, others shaking their heads in amazement. These were military families who understood the weight of words like moral courage and service above self. But the moment that will stay with me forever was watching my father slowly rise to his feet. Colonel Miguel Rodriguez, the man who had trained me to stand at attention, was standing for me. When the applause finally ended, General Hawkins smiled and returned to the podium. "Now where were we? Oh yes, promoting Major Diego Rodriguez to Lieutenant Colonel." The ceremony continued, but the energy had completely shifted. Diego received his promotion with all the proper formalities, but every eye in the room had already seen something more significant, the validation of a daughter who had never stopped serving, even when service cost her everything. As Diego pinned on his new rank, I caught his eye. Instead of the resentment I'd expected, I saw something that looked like respect. My little brother, now Lieutenant Colonel Diego Rodriguez, gave me the slightest nod, not of superiority, but of acknowledgement. When the ceremony ended, people began filing out, but several officers approached me. A colonel I'd never met shook my hand and said, "Thank you for your service, ma'am. It's an honor to meet you." A young captain, probably fresh out of West Point, asked if she could have her photo taken with me. "You're exactly the kind of officer I want to become," she said. But the real shock came when they learned exactly what I had been doing all these years, and how the daughter they'd disowned had become someone they couldn't ignore. The reception after Diego's ceremony was held in the Officers' Club courtyard, under string lights that cast everything in a warm, forgiving glow. I stood near the edge of the gathering, watching my family navigate this new reality where their greatest disappointment had become their greatest achievement. Diego approached first, his new lieutenant colonel insignia catching the light. Up close, I could see he'd aged in the years since I'd left home, lines around his eyes that spoke of deployments and responsibilities, a maturity that hadn't been there before. "You never told us," he said, his voice carrying something between accusation and awe. "You never asked," I replied, not unkindly. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. "I thought you left the army. I thought, after Afghanistan, you thought wrong. Why didn't you say anything? All these years we thought..." "You thought I was a failure, a disgrace, someone who couldn't handle military life." I kept my voice steady without bitterness. Why would I need to correct that impression? Diego was quiet for a long moment. "What you did tonight, having General Hawkins say those things, you could have destroyed us, made us look like fools. Is that what you think happened? Isn't it?" I studied my younger brother, this man who had just achieved the rank I'd held for 2 years. "Diego, I didn't come here to embarrass anyone. I came here to honor your achievement. The fact that my presence revealed some uncomfortable truths about assumptions our family made, that's not my responsibility to manage." Before he could respond, Carlos approached. My older brother moved with the careful precision that had always defined him, but I could see uncertainty in his eyes. "You've been active all this time. he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Lieutenant Colonel. That's... He paused, clearly struggling with the mathematics of military hierarchy. That's the same rank I have? It is. You outrank Diego. You outrank everyone in this family except Dad. Technically, yes. Carlos was quiet for nearly a minute, processing information that challenged everything he'd believed about his little sister. Finally, he asked, "Why didn't you tell us?" I tilted my head, studying the brother who had once been my hero. Carlos, when I was suspended, you told me I was reckless. You said what I did was black and white wrong. Why would I share anything with someone who had already decided I was a liability? That was different. You went against orders. And those orders were wrong. 27 people are alive because I went against orders. General Hawkins just told a room full of people that my actions are now taught as an example of moral leadership. I paused, letting that sink in. Were you wrong then, or is the entire army wrong now? Carlos opened his mouth, then closed it. For perhaps the first time in his life, my golden brother had no answer. The work I do requires judgment, Carlos. It requires looking at situations that don't fit into neat categories and making decisions that protect people. It's exactly what I did in Afghanistan, and it's what I've been doing ever since. But the secrecy, Why couldn't you trust us? Trust works both ways. When I needed your support, when I needed my family to believe that I might have had good reasons for my actions, you chose to believe I was wrong without asking questions. Why would I trust people who had already passed judgment? I saw him flinch, and for a moment I felt sorry for Carlos. He'd spent his entire life following rules, advancing through proper channels, building a career on careful decisions and political awareness. The idea that his disgraced sister had achieved equal rank through methods he couldn't understand or approve of was challenging everything he thought he knew about success. Then came the sound I'd never thought I'd hear again, my father's voice calling my name. Isabel. I turned to see Colonel Miguel Rodriguez approaching, and for the first time in years, he wasn't wearing the expression of a man disappointed in his daughter. He looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. Dad? You went against command. You got suspended. His voice carried less authority than usual, more confusion than anger. The suspension was reversed, I said calmly. My actions were officially justified. I saved lives. You never told us about the reversal. You never asked why I did what I did in the first place. He looked down, and I saw something I'd never seen from my father: doubt. Not doubt about military procedures or chain of command, but doubt about his own judgment. You raised us to follow orders, I continued, but you never taught us when not to. You trained us to respect authority, but not to recognize when authority might be wrong. I learned that on my own. My father was quiet for a long time, looking at the lieutenant colonel insignia on my uniform. Finally, he said, "Your mother and we've been worried about you. You thought I was living in shame, too embarrassed to contact you, proof that challenging the system leads to failure." Yes. Instead, I was building a career that you trained me for, using skills you taught me, serving the country you raised me to love. The only difference is that I learned to think for myself instead of just following scripts. Then my mother appeared beside my father, her eyes red from crying. "Mija," she said, using the Spanish endearment she hadn't called me in years. "I was always proud of you. I just didn't know how to say it." And for the first time since I'd walked into that auditorium, I felt something crack inside my chest, not breaking, but opening. "I know, Mom. I know." 6 months later, everything had changed in ways none of us could have imagined. 6 months after Diego's promotion ceremony, I sat in my office at Fort Bragg, planning an operation that would take me to 3 countries over the next month. The work continued as it always did, threats that emerged from shadows requiring responses that would never make headlines. But everything else had changed. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. "Dinner Sunday. Your mother is making tamales." It was our monthly tradition now, these family gatherings that had replaced years of silence with something I'd never experienced before: unconditional acceptance. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Trust, I'd learned, had to be rebuilt one conversation at a time. But it was being rebuilt stronger than before because now it was based on truth rather than expectation. Carlos had been the first to truly change. 2 weeks after the ceremony, he'd called me for advice on a decision that was troubling him, a subordinate who had violated protocol to help evacuees during a natural disaster. The old Carlos would have recommended disciplinary action by the book. Instead, he wanted to understand how to balance rules with human judgment. "I keep thinking about what you said," he told me during that call, about learning when not to follow orders. How do you know? You ask yourself what outcome serves the mission and protects people. Sometimes that aligns with regulations, sometimes it doesn't. The trick is being willing to accept responsibility for your judgment. He implemented the lesson, defending his subordinates' actions and turning a potential disciplinary case into a commendation for initiative. His soldiers noticed the change, a commander who thought about consequences rather than just compliance. Diego had surprised me even more. 3 months after his promotion, he'd requested assignment to Joint Special Operations Command. "I want to do the kind of work you do," he told me. "I want to matter." "You already matter, Diego. You don't need to prove anything." "Maybe not to you, but I need to prove something to myself. I spent my whole career following the path Dad laid out, never asking if it was the path I wanted. I'm 34 years old, and I just figured out that my little sister is who I want to be when I grow up." He was currently in selection training, learning skills that would either break him or make him into the kind of officer who operated beyond conventional parameters. I had faith he'd succeed. He had the intelligence and judgment he just needed to learn to trust them. My mother had become an unexpected advocate for military families dealing with children whose service didn't fit traditional molds. She'd started volunteering at a veteran support center, specifically working with parents who struggled to understand children in unconventional military careers. "I almost lost you because I didn't know how to see you," she told me during one of our dinners. "Other parents shouldn't make that mistake." But the most profound change was in my father. The man who had raised us to never question authority had become someone who encouraged questioning. Not rebellion, but thoughtful analysis of why rules existed and when they needed to be adapted. "I taught you to follow orders," he said, during a walk we took after Sunday dinner last month. "I should have taught you to evaluate them." "You taught me discipline and judgment, Dad. I just learned to apply them differently than you expected." "You learned to be a better soldier than I was." "I learned to be the soldier you trained me to be. You just couldn't see it at the time." The ripple effects extended far beyond our family. General Hawkins had forwarded me a letter from Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the aid workers I'd saved in Afghanistan. She was now running a mobile medical clinic that had treated over 3,000 children in refugee camps. "My daughter was born last year," Dr. Chen wrote. "I named her Isabel after the soldier who saved my life and made her existence possible. Those 27 lives you saved have touched thousands more. Thank you for choosing courage over compliance." I'd also received a request to speak at West Point's Leadership Symposium. The invitation read, "Your actions in Afghanistan and subsequent career represent exactly the kind of adaptive leadership our future officers need to understand." My message to those cadets would be simple. Rules exist to serve missions, not the other way around. Your job is to understand the mission so thoroughly that you know when rules help you achieve it and when they prevent you from achieving it. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. I was dating someone now, Major James Morrison, a fellow Special Operations officer who knew my worth before he knew my rank. He'd been part of the team that extracted those hostages from Somalia, and he'd watched me work for months before asking me to dinner. "You know what I love about you," he'd said recently. "You never apologize for being excellent." Last week, I received a call that would define the next chapter of my career. The Secretary of Defense wanted to see me, not for a mission briefing, but for something that would require me to step out of the shadows permanently. "We need someone to head a new task force," the Secretary explained during our meeting. "Counter-terrorism operations that require unconventional thinking and absolute moral clarity. someone who's proven they can make the right decision regardless of political pressure. The position would mean promotion to full colonel, a visible role, and responsibility for training the next generation of officers who would operate in the gray areas where policy met reality. I accepted, of course. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't proving others wrong, it's proving yourself right. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't being seen, but becoming someone worth seeing. And sometimes the girl who asked, "Why?" becomes the woman who teaches others to ask the same question. My family understands that now. More importantly, so do I.